if your entire justification for something is based on what the law says, you might as well just roll over. At that point, it's over. The game is over if that's your only justification for things.
Hey everybody, this is Byron with Springtime of Nations, and today I'm joined by Ace_Archist from Twitter. How's it going, Ace?
How's it going? I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm doing well. It's good to talk to you. This is actually the first time we've ever spoken in person,
Hmm.
although I like a lot of your tweets.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad someone does.
Yeah, no, I mean you're pretty active on there. The
Yeah.
tagline is funny, even just plant peppers and claymores.
Oh, yeah. And that's my friend Anna's tagline. She said that a long time ago.
Okay. Okay. So actually, I know we have some stuff to talk about with regard to, the anarchist movement and such like that. But before we even get started on that, one thing I kind of wanted to ask you was your personal history with the ideas of liberty. How did you get started in them? What attracted you to them?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So I grew up in mostly Republican household, right? And because of that, I had Fox News on like all the time in my house from my
Okay.
family. And which is not usually how you would expect this story to start, but it's funny because I found Judge Andrew Napolitano from Fox News, and I really liked the things he was saying. And then I looked into him more, and then through him, I found people like Ron Paul and then Tom Woods, and then through there, that was essentially like the jumping off point to a bunch of different like anarchist literature. From like Rothbard to Tucker, Emma Goldman, a bunch of like a bunch of different anarchists throughout the like pantheon.
I think that's a pretty common story these
Yeah.
days, particularly on the market anarchist
Hmm.
side of things. Is a lot
Yep.
like Ron Paul has brought so many people into the movement, right? And just introduce. I mean, it is pretty amazing just that he would exist as someone who essentially uh, was kind of coy about it, but did say that the state could be fully privatized as a
Right.
sitting member of Congress. That's pretty
Yeah. It's like when you think about the chances of it happening, right? It's like, how many Ron Pauls have there been? But then in another sense, it's like, wow, there was a Ron Paul. You know what I mean? So you can look at it in both like a black pill and white pill situation. It's just,
right.
I personally view it as like it's incredible that there was someone there who like woke people up, and I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the I guess the only analog I can think of from history maybe would be there was Colonel Green, right, who corresponded with Benjamin Tucker. He was
Oh, right. That's
right.
right.
He was
Yeah.
a colonel in the army, but also
Yep.
anarchist. That is actually sort of an interesting thing. It kind of leads me into another point about just generally how libertarians should feel about anarchists or libertarians sort of infiltrating the state or taking part in conventional politics. How do
Hmm.
you feel about that?
Yeah, I've struggled with this back and forth, but I think I've landed on like where I think the most consistent position is, which is that as long as you're doing it to sabotage in some sense, as long as you're not, if you go in there like, right, you do no harm, first of all, right? And then through there, you just spread the message and you work to sabotage these evil people's agendas. I think that's fantastic. I think that's great, right? Now, I do think there's always the, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely adage from Lord Acton that is, that is an argument against it. But as long as you're there and you can, there's in some sense remain pure, like Ron Paul, then I think that's great, right? So
Yeah, I'm in
kind
agreement
of
about that.
you have
Yeah.
to kind of take it on a case by case basis.
Yeah, and I do think it is. It's interesting to see. Lately, I've been seeing some controversy on Twitter where, uh, there's some people who are saying stuff like Ron DeSantis is better than Rand Paul. That was something that kind of annoyed
Hmm.
me lately.
Yeah.
Um, where I mean, I can on one hand, I sort of see what they're saying in that um, just I get the impulse to want to praise someone for, doing
Right.
a particularly good thing. But like, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Like, I
Exactly.
think it's very important that we separate, the movement conservatives or standard Republicans, even when they do something good and worthy of praise, like from the actual libertarians who are, are men on the inside, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It's like I understand why people did it, right? It's like he stood up against the vaccine passports, right? And people want to praise him for that, But it's also like, I mean, the comparison with like Rand Paul, like, yeah, even Rand Paul, I'm not, I think Rand Paul's done some pretty things in Congress, but he's also done some great things, right? Like standing up against the drone program or NSA spying, things like that, right? So I think that comparison when people make that is a little off, but yeah, we should always be careful not to, like if like if libertarians have learned anything, it's that siding with conservatives will often get us stabbed in the back, right? Or at least like the political conservatives at the very least.
Right. Yeah, and some of them are certainly better than others, but
Hmm.
I agree with you 100% as a general thing. That's something that libertarians need to shy away from, and I think that there's a conflation that often happens, which is sort of dangerous, right? Because I don't object inherently, the way that some people who are super hardcore into the LP do, to just the idea of running as a Republican, right?
Right, I
If
agree.
someone like Ron Paul is going to run as a Republican, that's completely fine. But that's a different thing than pledging loyalty to the Republican
That's
Party.
right.
Like Ron Paul was extremely hostile to the establishment of the Republican Party for his entire existence. And by establishment, it's not just the neocons, but also it's not like Ron was throwing his support behind any old populist who happened to talk shit about the status quo.
Exactly. He refused to endorse Romney in the 2012 election, which was great.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, that is very great.
Yeah, it's like I'm not opposed to like, and I actually think this would be a good strategy if it could work, but that's in some sense begging the question, which is just, and it seems dirty, but just like lie, like run as a Republican in some sense and lie just to get in there and then completely try to sabotage it. Uh, that is one strategy. It's not something I'm advocating for on a day-to-day basis, but I certainly don't. I'm certainly not opposed to it if they're like sleeper cell like libertarian agents inside Congress. I think that
Oh
would
yeah,
actually be
I mean,
great.
and I think that that is something that, and I don't want to get too specific here because who knows, who. I'm not going to be paranoid or anything, but I
Right,
do
right.
think that is something that does go on.
Yeah.
At least not, maybe not in the U.S. Congress so much,
Hmm.
but certainly in state legislatures, there are people
Yes.
um, who maybe have campaigned presenting themselves as much more of traditional conservatives, and actually are quite sympathetic to more of our views,
Right. Yep. 100%.
which is that can be tricky too, because sometimes you have to walk that line of how Machiavellian do you want to be,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
um I know, like, so for example, myself, like personally, um I'm not religious and
Hmm.
I'm pro-choice, but if I were to I don't think, like, if I were to ever run, or not that that would happen, but if someone like me were to, I don't think it would be the worst thing to present yourself for the sake of winning a Republican primary, because this is basically mandatory right now
Yeah.
to present yourself as being pro-life, even though I disagree with that.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's like if you have to like lie to get into the thieves' den to essentially sabotage it, I don't think there's any like moral problem to it. Like you can get into the idea of, well, is there a moral problem with lying to the voters? It's like, well, maybe, although they're being lied to no matter what. So at least you're lying to them to actually stop the beast, you know what I mean? So
Right.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that that's something that libertarians can benefit from generally, is
Hmm.
more sort of Machiavellian thinking.
Yes.
Yeah, because that's something that everyone else does, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I think a lot of times libertarians get hung up on the idea, and I talked about this a lot in the video on strategy, is just, we're just going to go out and make our arguments again and again to whoever
Right.
listen, and that's the road to victory. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. If we can just make our arguments really, really concise and consistent, then we'll win, right? Well, no, we don't win. Most people are not persuaded by that type of reasoning. Most people are more persuaded by what makes them feel good, or what
Yeah,
does this person say that makes them feel good.
I mean, and just like Brian Kaplan pointed out, you can't even necessarily blame them for that. I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
uh, thinking about politics in a way where you're likely to come to any sort of reasonable conclusion is not an easy thing, and it's not a very intuitive thing for most people, and it's something that is most people find rather boring.
Right. It's so far out of the Overton window that most people are not going to spend their time actively looking. And the people who do are going to be the ones, who do actually encounter us. But most people, as you said, they're not interested, and nor should they be, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But to bring us back to, something like the police issue, right? Like that doesn't mean that libertarians should despair, because
Right.
just like like the communists or anyone else, the fascists, anyone else has realized, right? You don't have to make these sort of autistic arguments to the
Hmm.
masses. What you would do is you find stuff that they already actually care about, and then frame those issues in the context of the broader ideology. Right.
That's right.
That's what the Bolsheviks did so successfully in Russia. Right. Like they, no random Russian peasants cared about some weird German economist.
Right.
Right. And his theories. What they cared about was what was going on right in front of them.
Yeah, no, you're so right. It's that's the exact way to approach it, is you have to start from where people are, right? You have to have that grounding, that basis, and then you have to work from there. There's no just asserting your own position. That's going to take extra work, because you then have to get people on board, and then you have to make the arguments after they're already on board. Rather, if you just start from where they are, you can kind of find out what they like, what appeals to them politically, and then you can kind of wiggle your way in, because libertarianism is quite malleable, right? You
Right.
can you can make these inroads in different directions, different types of arguments, and they can lead to where you want them to lead, but you can come at it from a bunch of different places, which I think is what needs to happen, and which is what should happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. One thing that's sort of been an obstacle to that sort of strategic thinking is the very, very harsh divide, and often, uh, bitter, a divide which has a lot of bitter and scornful words coming out of it between left and right libertarians,
Hmm.
right? Which, people who are divided along the lines of the broader culture war, and can't seem to bring themselves to cooperate. And I would say that perhaps it's not entirely realistic to expect people to cooperate, or at least depending on how closely. For example, I mean, you have there's a type of person who is going to be attracted to something like C4SS, and there's another type of person who's going to be attracted to LouRockwell.com, right? And
Sure.
even though those people might, in terms of their actual political views, they might be pretty similar, right? Like almost identical in some cases, but in terms of their cultural views, they're going to be really different, and that can create a lot of tension and make broader strategy harder.
Yeah, absolutely. And it touches on the point we were just talking about, which is that you know when we're making inroads when we're starting where people are, and making and driving them towards a libertarian position from where they are, they're not going to drop their cultural baggage. And I don't mean baggage in a derogatory term. I just mean that
Right.
they're carrying it with them. They're going to keep their culture with them as they go to libertarianism. Then that goes for a lot of the term right and left libertarian is there's so many different meanings for that term, but I think the way most people use it is just they divide it culturally,
Right.
whether you're a culturally left person or culturally right. And as you're saying, it's like if you come to this through like the lens of, well, a freed market will be more like egalitarian in general, which is something I do agree with. I do think it more than now, obviously, right? Obviously, that might appeal to someone on culturally on the left, right, or like minority rights, things like that, right? And then on the left, sorry, and then on the right, you would have people like very concerned about like economic efficiency, money, all these things, right? So yeah, they're going to it does make it hard, but I really think the way to I think unity itself, people trying to force this type of unity, I don't think unity is necessary as long as both people agree, at least in some broad sense, that look, um, aggression is wrong, right? That's like the basis, okay? As long as people agree on that, then we shouldn't have to squabble like in the meantime in the process, right? So even after we hit an anarchist society, theoretically, there are still going to be people who disagree culturally. In my view, in my idea is that some of these people will self-segregate into their own like cultural like enclaves in some sense, right?
Right.
Yeah. So it can get fixed afterwards.
And in the meantime, though, one thing that I've thought, and I've tried to convince people to do this, with not a lot of success so far, but basically it's just a policy of, you could say, not punching to the libertarian. And I don't know if there's more eloquent words for that, but
Right.
basically what I mean is, so if you're a right libertarian, for example, you can criticize statist leftists, and you would be incentivized to do so in order to sort of get your credit with the other right wingers who you're trying to appeal to and draw into libertarianism. But you shouldn't go out of your way. You certainly shouldn't, if at all possible, criticize left libertarians. And the same for left libertarians. You can criticize statist right wingers, but you shouldn't criticize right-wing libertarians insofar as it can be avoided.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. It's like I feel like the ones who really get into it, like the left libertarians and the right libertarians, as long as we're talking like culturally speaking, they seem to in some sense put culture ahead of like the real enemy here.
Oh,
And that's not to
they
say
absolutely do.
and that's not to say culture isn't important, right? I think culture is a big driving force behind the state. And so I don't want to come across as saying that, one of those libertarians who will say like, oh, culture is just irrelevant. No, I don't agree with that. But it's certainly, you shouldn't like, as long as you're going the same place, you shouldn't hit each other or, try to kill each other when, the real enemy is the state,
Yes. I think too that, it can get harder in practice when we come down to, everyone agrees that the end goal is getting
right.
state. But then in the meantime, what do we do about such and such issue? Like I once had someone propose like this to me. They said like, okay, so suppose that the government were to defund all welfare, but only the welfare for minorities, like blacks or Hispanics or something, and they were to keep welfare for white people. That would obviously be a policy based on racial discrimination, which a lot of people would rightfully have an objection to. But then you could argue, if you're just ignoring race, and the same thing, either you could say it either way, like suppose that you only cut the welfare for white people. You could argue that's still, any cut in government is something that we should support. And that is sort of an interesting, like stuff like that is what really starts to, become uncomfortable for, cultural divides across or within the libertarian movement.
Right.
But I don't think that,
go ahead.
Happily, those are not issues that are real. This is not like something that anyone's actually proposing. So it's not super important that we really like talk about that a lot, I think.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting dilemma, right? I think I would like because like from obviously from a left-wing libertarian perspective, this would be terrible because in some sense it's in some sense the state targeting people, but it's not targeting in the sense it's aggressing against them, but it's targeting in the sense that it's giving unfair or preferential treatment to another company or to another, group, right? So I do see their perspective there. But then again, it's kind of like, is it fair if like if you had like if you had a slave master on a plantation, if he lets one slave go every so often, right? Well, it's not fair to the other slaves, obviously. That I think that'd be like the right libertarian response to that. But it's still better that one slave goes free rather than keeping them all, enslaved type thing. But yeah, those types of arguments, as you said, they don't really come up much. Those no one's really advocating that policy. And as far as like what, like I don't in some sense, right? I don't think you need to like come together in the sense that each libertarian needs to be in lockstep with the other libertarian as far as what should we do, how should we get there. I'm much more comfortable with like a broad, wide net approach, right? Like you throw a bunch of things at the wall, see what sticks, and left libertarians can pursue what they think will work. Right libertarians can pursue what they think will work, and they can both do this without, in some sense, coming into too much conflict. There will still be conflict, but I think if you let people do as they wish, even on the road to get there, we'll see like a quote unquote free market arise on what is the most efficient way to get there.
Anarchy first.
Yes, anarchy first.
And that comes into that sort of gets into similar ideas that have been pushed by people like Keith Preston and the Attack the System crowd.
Yeah, love him.
Calling for like a broader coalition of, or just the general idea of pan secessionism, although
Yes.
which is of course something that we take a special interest in Springtime of Nations, and
yeah,
to comparing and like pointing out the really the similarities between the struggle against the state in general, and as well as the struggle, I mean, because really the struggle against a foreign state, which is what we call a national struggle, is merely a subset of the broader struggle against authority and oppression.
Right. Yeah, it's all on the same spectrum.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny too, because that's something that I think that a lot of leftists, or at least a certain type of leftists, can be quite hostile to, which honestly I don't really understand. I mean, I think that a lot of that comes particularly after the Second World War and the rise of fascism and totalitarian nationalism and such.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look like before that, I mean, and I even talked about this in the video, right? Like people like left-wing anarchists like Bakunin, he was a Slavic nationalist. Proudhon was very clearly a French nationalist.
Yeah.
And although he wouldn't call it that, and they clashed with the official nationalist Ukrainian government, there were shades of like Ukrainian nationalism, even among the, communists like Makhno.
Right.
And even today, if you look at, I talked about in my video on Rojava, clearly the Kurdish anarchist struggle is intertwined with Kurdish nationalism, and those are positions that people hold simultaneously there on the ground.
Yeah, it's like, so I understand, I can understand in some sense, like, right, the leftist critique against nationalism, because it does tend to, like, you can look through history at things that were hyper nationalist or hyper populist, right, can lead to very bad things. But my response to that would be that, just not every nationalism doesn't fundamentally lead to more tyranny, right? Like it's obviously not the end goal, right? But it's in some sense, the end goal is every person is a nation, right?
Right.
Yeah. And it's just breaking it down from there. So you keep going smaller and smaller. It's like, like an argument against secession that some people would give, some anarchists would give. Well, you're just creating another state or a smaller state. Okay, yes, but I would rather create smaller and smaller states, like city states, like thousands of city states from one state, than have just that one state, you know?
Sure. And pragmatically, I think it's much more likely too that if there is not sort of a global world order
Right.
that's watching over everything, it's going to be much easier for us to achieve some at least local political success somewhere in terms of complete uh, anarchy. Now, I also think that the pan-secessionism part of it strategically is just a matter of recognizing the reality of the current political situation, right? If you think about all the trends in society and the trends in geopolitics that are pushing the world and pushing the international community towards more statism, what are those things aligned with? In my view, at least, it seems clear that they're aligned with um, sort of the gradual supplanting of the nation state by a kind of more globalized world order, which
Yeah,
there are
absolutely.
some positive aspects to that. I mean, I'm in favor of free trade. I agree with the globalists on that.
Sure.
But overall, clearly, that is resulting in less individual liberty.
Yeah, it's like right I mean there's two sides. It's a spectrum obviously, but there's two main endpoints, right? One is anarchism where each person is their own sovereign, and the other is a one world government, right? That's the other side. So if we're approaching a full globalization in the sense that we're headed toward, a quasi one world government, I think, but if we have to pick, then the nationalism is much better, right? Than the pan-secessionist movement, at the very least, form of nationalism is vastly superior, vastly to some type of globalization, because look how much destruction these people cause with nations alone. You don't want them getting, you don't want a cabal of them working together.
Right. I mean, and at least with, if you have different empires all struggling against each other, then that creates opportunities, right? Like, because
Yeah.
when the whole system is stagnant and it's just one power that's so entrenched,
Hmm.
my concern is that it will be impossible to ever dislodge it if it ever takes, that much of a hold.
Yeah.
My hope is that we don't see the system get to that point, and I think that there will be, sometime this century, like a moment of revolutionary tension where there's a chance for things to be quite different. Now, whether that is different in the direction of liberty, I think remains to be seen, and part of that is going to depend on how organized the supporters of liberty are.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I do think, like, this idea of, like, even just like taking over a small town politically, like just getting a group of libertarians or anarchists there to take over a town, that would just be like a proof of concept, like a victory, right? On a very small scale. So I think it's definitely something to pursue. It's the argument against like national, like as I was saying before, I get the argument against nationalism, but if the choice is between like globalization, which is going towards a global government, then yeah, obviously the easy choice is obviously to me like some form of nationalism. But it's not, when libertarians say this, it's not like we're saying that yeah, nationalism is good in of itself, right? Only in
Right.
relation on the spectrum to something worse. Right. So it's not, I think some people get confused when they say, this is like the people who say like Hans Hoppe is a monarchist. That's just, that's not true. But he's
Right.
just saying, in comparison to the, a full like global democracy, a monarchism is obviously superior.
And I also would say that particularly as we start to see the world becoming more homogenized culturally,
Hmm.
and I mean, already it seems like there's sort of a bit of a monoculture among younger people, right? You can go to almost any country in the world now,
Yeah.
and they're kind of listening to the same music.
Yes, exactly.
Um, but the like really like traditional cultures, or at least cultures that aren't plugged into that Western dominated global world order, uh, are can sort of represent like bastions of resistance, and especially as we start to see state authority ceded to the level of international organizations, which I think we will see more and more in the future.
Hmm.
Um, you know, particularism in the form of religious or ethnic or cultural affiliations can serve as an alternative um, an alternative institution that demands loyalty that's not the state, right? So
Right.
you can owe your loyalty to something other than a state, which I think is
Yes.
a powerful thing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think going to what you said, how like, cultures become homogenized more and more. I think a lot of libertarians will like on the surface level think this is a really good thing, because markets, obviously, this is what happens with free markets is that, cultures get spread and mixed and this happens. And on the basis of a free market, I don't think there's much wrong with that. But when it comes with, in the culture of a state, it's often a package deal, right? It's
Right.
often well, yes, it's good that these markets have essentially created like arteries through between cultures, but
Yeah.
it's not great when their cultural identity is stripped in favor of a state, in favor of loyalty to a state or recognition of foreign states.
I mean, it's just
Uh,
like Tucker said, when he was talking about interests, we don't
mhm.
object to it in a free market, but the complaint of the anarchist is that the market
Yes.
is not free.
That's right, exactly. So I think libertarians should be more skeptical of like homogenization in the sense of like culture within the structures of a state, because usually what happens is that they'll see, right. This goes back to like Bastiat's seen versus the unseen. We see the great thing how these cultures are now getting mixed, and now there's more it is in some senses enriching all the cultures together, but this is also coming at the cost of they're losing some sense of their identity in the process, which wasn't anarchism necessarily, but it was certainly not, headed towards a world government.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's even the uh, statists, I think, can acknowledge that there is quite a bit of iffy things going on to put this in sharp relief. Let's take an example like Tibet, right?
Hmm.
Who can not acknowledge that the Tibetans have undergone basically a cultural genocide at the hands of the People's Republic of China,
Yeah.
right? And clearly that's not something that would have occurred in a free market, and that's not something that libertarians should ignore. And I'm not saying that they do. I think you'd be very hard pressed to find anyone who would defend that. But I think that's like an extreme example of I guess what we should see as a general trend that happens throughout the world and will continue to happen more as the global world order continues its life cycle and its quest for power.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, sometimes like libertarians will say, well, it's great that there's all these free trade agreements, between nations and countries. When I criticize this, I'm not saying obviously, right, that the government should be involved in some sense more. But my criticism is that in a lot of these like free trade agreements, they often ignore that a lot of these, they're actually like privileging corporations
Oh yeah.
and right, so it's much more of a corporatist free trade document more than it is like some laissez-faire document where it's just people trading, right?
And
Because
they often put in more enforcement mechanisms for intellectual property and
that's right.
you know,
Yeah. And so like libertarians need to be careful about like not just seeing that, oh well, this is good because these countries are trading now, there's more competition. It's like, yes, this is good, but there's also a Trojan horse in all of these, right? It always comes with like they would never be doing this if it was actually headed towards libertarian principles, because corporations and the state don't want libertarian principles, right? They work together.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and something that's sort of I'm seeing a lot of libertarians, particularly on the right, start to come to terms with
Yeah.
is the um, I mean, I would say downright malevolence of certain corporate interests that are
Right.
working in tandem with the state. Because, and it's not like this is such a recent thing. I mean, this has been going on forever, right? Corporatism. This is something Tucker talked about in the 30s, how he was pessimistic about the chances for a free society now that monopoly had been so entrenched by the forces of government even then. And this
Yeah.
is here we are 90 years later talking about it. But I think recently what's happened is right libertarians have really woke up to that because of the corporations taking a decidedly culturally left wing stance on most issues and
Mhm.
working in tandem with the government. I mean that's what we see for like the vaccine passports, for instance.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And like that's been my favorite like turn like of libertarianism, at least like culturally, has been this, looking at corporations as almost an arm of the state in a lot of senses. It's been great. I've loved to see that across Twitter. Um, my friend El Pulpo would on Twitter would call these people like the ones who just like defend the corporations. Oh well, it's a private company; they can do what they want. Is like neo-libertarians. I think I like that term. That's a good term. Because it's like they act like neoliberals, right? In the sense that they care about quote unquote free markets, but really it's just like corporate privilege. Uh,
Right.
uh, so yeah, I think what people miss is that like look, and this like sometimes you'll get the criticisms from the left. Oh, the left, some like the left states will just say, oh, you just want these corporations, to run everything. It's like no, if libertarians and corporations were really buddies, why is it that the corporations never ever donate to any libertarian
Oh yeah,
candidates,
no, the
right?
corporations they
It's like
well, I guess what they'd say is the Koch brothers, right?
oh right,
I forgot
yeah.
the Koch brothers.
Oh yeah. Wow, you can find one. It's like the exception that proves the rule, right? You found one. You found one. And maybe you could throw in Peter Thiel, right? Let's give them two.
And even the Koch brothers, that's something that's sort of
Yeah, it's
strange. Is that, they've so much of what they've done is basically been, I don't want to be too harsh, but
mhm.
I want to say like stooges for the Republican Party.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, because if with that kind of money that they're throwing at things, you'd think they'd come up with something better than just throwing it away in election after election, the most important election of our lifetimes,
Right.
right? Like, how about what if you paid people who passed an ideological test to move to a certain area? You subsidize that, right?
Yeah,
How about
exactly.
that? Now you'd have real geographic power start to concentrate. What if you like sponsored the careers of people who agreed with you and you started to uh you know build institutional power the way that the left did starting in the 60s?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot better uses than just throwing everything away on electoral campaigns. Not that electoral campaigns are bad per se, but especially when you're just going after generic Republicans.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's like, the Koch brothers, going back to them, they don't even target like libertarians in the radical sense, right? They get like, some of the more like moderate LP types lean in like the conservatarians, right? That's basically, and then the outright Republicans. So it's like they're not even targeting, the actual radicals, which should, uh, kind of vindicates our point. But yeah.
Yep. And then obviously on the other side, I think that fits into the dichotomy that Rothbard talked about, and I mentioned this in an earlier video but between Leninist opportunism and adventurism, where you have some libertarians who are super into like party politics and stuff like that, and they don't even want to think about the bigger picture at all, or think about like how are we going to actually get to Ancapistan, as it were.
Right.
But then also you have people who are anarchists and they're seemingly just profoundly uninterested in doing anything.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. It's,
Yeah.
yeah. It's like, yeah, as you said, on one hand, you have the people who are just like, well, how can we cut taxes by 2.4% next year? You have those people, the extreme pragmatists who do not have like an end goal in sight. Um, and then you have, or a supreme end goal anyway, and then you have the anarchists who will just like theorize all day. And like I'm gonna be honest, I like to theorize, but it's obviously
Oh,
it should
theorizing is
never,
fun.
yeah, it should never be mistaken for you should never think, okay, once I'm done theorizing, mission accomplished, right? That I think that's where people go wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been trying to convince people for a while now to really just even take very small steps, right? You don't have to, no one's telling you have to do anything big, right? Like, depending
Hmm.
on how personally invested you are. But how about just having a regular meeting with like-minded libertarians where you're not necessarily joking around the whole time. You're talking about like, okay, guys, like what can we all do to work together to accomplish this week or this month or this year,
Right.
right? And it doesn't, it doesn't have to be something big, right? It could be like, okay, we're all going to, like we're all going to like put up a flyer or something like that. Not that that's the best thing necessarily, but it can be anything. The point is not so much what you're exactly doing. The point is that you're building that infrastructure of a team, right?
Right.
Because eventually, you know, when the situation becomes more serious, as I believe it will, the people who are used to working as a team are the people who are going to have a profound advantage.
Yeah, and this is where the left really wins, right? This is the left is great at organizing. It's like their best feature, right? Is that they generally are able to mobilize huge amounts of people in insane numbers. And I think if libertarians kind of took that tact, it wouldn't be as successful, obviously, because libertarians are a much smaller minority. But it would at least, as you said, build that dynamic between people that is necessary for it to grow, right? You always have to start small, right? You always have to take a first step if you're going to go anywhere.
Right, absolutely. And actually, that brings me back to this is something I kept forgetting to bring up is the police stuff. As far as like
Yeah.
that's an example of leftist organizing. I mean, they've accomplished some admirable things with all their protests and things. I don't know why some libertarians it's become sort of a meme that protests don't work. That's
Right. Yeah.
completely absurd.
That is. It's
Uh,
crazy.
I mean, obviously, just look at like why did the Vietnam War end? Why are different like localities putting more restrictive measures against police now?
Right.
Clearly, it has an effect.
Yes.
Um, and that brings me to just the idea of how libertarians should view and get involved into that whole discussion around policing, right? Because obviously, we want the police to be uh, abolished, right?
Yeah.
At least in the form that they exist, right?
Yes.
And I think that is something that at least on the surface level, we certainly have a lot in common with even some very statist leftists. Although I guess my concern would be that there might be a little bit of people might be a little disingenuous sometimes. Like
Oh,
I think
yes.
sometimes when they say abolish the police, what they really mean is abolish the police and then replace them with like a a new government organization which is going to be more institutionally left wing than the police are, since the police are pretty right wing overall, and
Yeah.
have them enforce whatever the leftists want.
I mean, yeah, that's exactly it, right? It's like when they were saying abolish the police, it was like, yeah, that's great, but then later on, they even like a lot of the people who were the biggest proponents of abolish the police were later came out and said, oh, actually, we abolish the police, and I'm not being hyperbolic. They really said this. They said abolish the police doesn't actually mean abolish the police. It's
Right.
they said we want to defund them, and by defund we mean reallocate resources differently or allocate resources differently. And it's like, okay, I see what's going on here.
I mean, that's an opportunity for like a very radical message to get swamped by
Yeah.
social democrats, as it always does.
Yeah. And the left was even attacking each other over this, right? Because there were some leftists who were really genuine. They're like, no, abolish it completely. And those were like, God bless them, right? It's like, yeah, go for it. But then you had the other leftists who were, they're not even leftists. They're just like, liberals in like a democratic sense, where
Social
they're just like,
democrats.
so yeah, social democrats are like, no, we just need to, allocate the resources differently. We might need more funding, more training, stuff like this. So it immediately got swamped out by
Yeah,
the.
more funding, not
That's
defund.
right. That's right.
That's because that's what the police need. They need more funding.
That's right. It's like, oh, something's gone terribly wrong. Well, they must just need more money.
Yeah, I mean, and it really is insane the way that that's just how their minds work.
Yeah, it's like
Uh,
with schools, right? Just you gotta
yeah,
just keep
right.
pumping more money.
Now, to be fair, I do think that there is like with this whole like defund the police movement, right?
Mhm.
There have been some movements towards exactly that, which I think libertarians should be completely in favor of, and
Yeah,
I think that that's something that is obviously going to put us at quite a bit of tension with conservatives, right? And which is really a shame, I think, because I don't know when conservatives are going to wake up to the fact that, like, despite being institutionally, somewhat right wing, the police are not fundamentally aligned with their interests, right? They're the ones who are going to come take their guns away as soon
yeah.
as the next whatever regime orders it.
This is like one of my pet issues because I came from the right. It boggles my mind when I hear conservatives talk about the police because it's like, especially when you see those "Don't Tread on Me" stickers along with the blue thin blue line stickers, it just enrages me. It's like the very people who you're saying come and take them, right, in an aggressive sense, and will come and take them. Those are the people. The cops are the ones
Yeah,
who
they're,
you're
they're going to come and
saying.
take them.
Yes, exactly. And it's like you then now I will give credit. I do think there has been a little bit of a shift in some conservatives where they've started to view the police as at the very least not aligned with their interests, right, over time, especially when you saw like during the riots how the police just stood by and let people's cities burn to the ground, local businesses burn to the ground, and they did nothing. uh, I think that might have woken conservatives up a little bit, so I will give them that, but overall they're still terrible on this issue.
I mean, it's the same story. I think you had a similar sort of shift, not from the right, but just from people in general, in with like the LA riots, where you had, you know, like the famous roof Koreans who were
Yeah.
literally just victimized because of their race.
Yep.
When they defended themselves, but it's not like the heroic LA police department would be willing to intervene and stop that. But then after it's all over, when there's no more danger, the heroic police are going to come in and arrest the merchants for defending themselves, like
Yeah.
they have illegal weapons.
Right. Oh my God. When conservatives like latch on to like I know this is kind of like going off of a different point, but when conservatives latch on to like they had an illegal gun, right? It's like, okay, if you base your entire Second Amendment rights on what is currently legal, there all that says is that, oh, we just need to change the definitions of which guns are legal now,
Right.
right?
I mean,
And
it's the
they'll just
same
throw them away. It's
argument
just
that leftists very effectively make against conservatives about like immigration. Like
yes.
conservatives would be like, well, listen, I'm in favor of, I just don't like illegal immigration. It's like, oh, okay. So basically what you're saying is just whatever the government says is legal or illegal. Like what an arbitrary thing. You can't think of,
Yeah.
I mean, because you might have a little more respect for them if they, were to even say like, well, I want my community to be with, people who are like me or something. Now, I don't think that you should be enforce that by force on anyone, but much
At least they're
worse.
not appealing to the
This
law.
dichotomy between legal and illegal. That what you're saying there is just I'm the government's bitch,
Yes.
and I, just don't like people crossing some arbitrary line out in the desert, right? It's not like because it's not like you're mad that they're particularly moving into your neighborhood. It's like you have this abstract idea of territory that used to be part of Mexico anyway. People are
Right.
crossing some line out in the desert,
Yeah.
and you think that men with guns should go like put them in cages for doing that.
Yeah. It's like, going back to your point, it's like, yeah, it might not be a good thing when conservatives would say that, or if conservative were to say that, well, I just don't want them in my community. But at the very least, they're not appealing to the law, right?
Right.
If your entire justification for something is based on what the law says, you might as well just roll over. At that point, it's over. The game is over if that's your only justification for things, right? Because at that point, that just means that the lawmakers can just change the law, and then if you want to be consistent, then you just gotta, well, the law says I gotta get in the train car now, and off I go.
I think that's what a lot of conservatives will say if they don't change.
Yeah, when the cops come to take their guns, like I had a tweet a couple days ago. It's like, when conservatives say "come and take it," they mean it sincerely, right?
Ah,
The
yes, that's
cops,
a
when
good
they
one.
when the cops come to take their guns, they will give them away.
Yep, and I don't doubt it. Well, this has been about an hour so far, I think. Was there anything else you wanted to cover before we cut it off?
No, I think that was good. I will shout out I and a couple of my friends, Cotton and Jay on Twitter. We have a new podcast. It's called Slurp Gang. It's not political in any sense, but it's just us like being stupid. So if you want to check out that, and if you're not like looking for a political podcast, maybe check that out. And that's all.
Okay. Yeah, no, that sounds great. It's like comedy?
Yeah, it's just us scooping around. It's not. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, so that's awesome. Be sure to follow Ace at it's Ace_Archist
Yep. That's it.
on Twitter. Be sure to follow Springtime of Nations on Twitter. Our official account is Charles Henry Lee with a 3 for the last E. You can also follow myself, Byron, on Twitter at unterrifiedjeff. And finally, check out our springtimeofnations.org website. We're making new improvements to that all the time. And of course, our friends at the Liberty Guild Discord server. There'll be links to all these things in the description. Subscribe to Springtime of Nations. Like the video if you're interested. And subscribe. Yeah, if you want to see more content like this, leave a comment down below too about anything you found interesting in the video. Just leave a comment in general for the algorithm is what I'm trying to say. Anyway, yeah, thanks so much for joining me, Ace.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
Yep. And thanks to all the listeners. I will talk to you all next time.